Chapter 24 of Mary Louise Solves a Mystery by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Mary Louise has an intuition. "I wish, Josie," said Mary Louise dolefully, "you'd let me help in this search for Alora." "I'd be glad to, dear, if I could think of a single thing you could do," replied her friend. "Just now I'm on the most tedious task imaginable, visiting the army of cab drivers, horse and taxi, here in Chicago, and trying to find the one who carried a woman and a girl away from the Blackington at 6 o'clock that eventful Tuesday morning." "Have you met with any success at all?" asked Mary Louise. "That question proves you're not fitted for detective work," Josie laughingly asserted. "A moment's reflection would assure you that when I found my man my search would be ended. Ergo, no success has yet attended my efforts. I've interviewed a couple of hundreds, however, and that leaves only a few hundreds left to question." "But the whole thing drags terribly," complained Mary Louise. "Days are passing and who knows what may be happening to poor Alora while you are hanging around the cab stands." Josie's face grew grave. In sober tones she said: "I'm just as anxious as you are, Mary Louise, but this case is really puzzling, because Chicago is such a big city that criminals may securely hide themselves here for months, even for years, without being discovered. Mrs. Orme was clever enough to leave a few traces behind her. As far as clues are concerned, she might have evaporated into thin air, taking Alora with her, except for this matter of the cabman. That's why I'm pinning my faith to this search, knowing all the time, nevertheless, that Mrs. Orme may have provided for even that contingency and rendered the discovery of the cabman impossible. To do that, however, she would have to use a private equipage, involving a confederate, and I believe she preferred to take chances with a hired cab." "What are the police doing?" inquired Mary Louise nervously. "Nothing. They were soon discouraged and lost interest in the matter when I took hold of the case. But I don't intend to get discouraged. I hate to be stumped, as you know, and it seems to me, after careful consideration, that success may follow the discovery of the cab driver. I've not been neglecting other trails, I assure you. I've obtained a pretty fair record of the history of Nurse Orme. She has the habit of drudging in sick rooms until she accumulates enough capital to lead a gay life for a month or so, after which she resumes nursing in order to replenish her purse. She's a good nurse and a wild spendthrift, but aside from the peculiarity mentioned, there's nothing in her career of especial interest. The woman is pretty well known, both in New York and Chicago, for she squanders in the first city and saves in the other, but of her early history there is no information available. In her wildest moods she has never done anything to warrant her arrest, yet the police have kept a suspicious eye on her for years." "Poor Alora!" wailed Mary Louise miserably. "I wish I could do something for her." "You did a lot for her when you put me on her trail," declared Josie with conviction. "I've a hunch I shall win. I've wired Daddy O'Gorman all about the case, but he says he can't advise me. In other words, he's watching to see whether I make good or cave in, and I just dare not fail. So keep your courage, Mary Louise, and muster all the confidence you are able to repose in me. I may not know all the tricks of the sleuths, but I know some of them. And now I'm off to interview more cabmen." Mary Louise sighed as her friend left her. She was indeed very unhappy and restless during those days of tedious waiting. Peter Conant had come to Chicago on the Colonel's demand, but Mary Louise couldn't see how he was able to help them one bit. "Of course," the lawyer had said in his terse, choppy manner, "whoever abducted the girl is criminally liable. We can put the party in jail." "When we get her," suggested Mary Louise impatiently. "The party is Mrs. Orme; we have established that fact without a doubt, and if we could get her, we'd also get Alora." "Just so," Peter replied, "and between the O'Gorman girl and the police, we ought to capture the woman soon. I have a degree of confidence in Josie O'Gorman, and somewhat more confidence in the police." "Do you think we should notify Jason Jones?" inquired Colonel Hathaway. "I have considered that, sir, in all its phases, and, knowing the man's peculiar characteristics, I believe such a course is not yet desirable. Jones is so enthralled by his latest craze over aviation that he would be no fit adviser, and could render no practical assistance in the search for his daughter. On the other hand, his association would be annoying, for he would merely accuse you of neglect in permitting Alora to be stolen while in your care. I have seen a copy of his wife's will, and know the girl's loss may cost him his guardianship, and the perquisites that pertain to it. In that case, he will probably sue you for the loss of the money, claiming Alora's abduction was due to your carelessness." "He could not win such an absurd suit, however," declared the Colonel. "Still, he might be awarded damages," asserted the lawyer. "Juries are uncertain. The law is somewhat elastic. Judges are peculiar." "Don't worry, Grandpa Jim," said Mary Louise soothingly, as she sat on the arm of his chair and rubbed the wrinkles from his forehead. "There must be such a thing as justice, even in law." "Law is justice," stated Mr. Conant, resenting the insinuation, "but justice is sometimes recognized by humans in one form and sometimes in another. I do not say that Jason Jones should collect damages on such a complaint, but he assuredly would have a case." Mr. Conant had desired to return home after the first conference with his client, but he admitted that his wife was recovering from her indisposition, and a kindly neighbor was assisting Irene in the care of her, so he yielded to his client's urgent request to remain. Colonel Hathaway was more alarmed by Alora's disappearance than he allowed Mary Louise to guess, and he wanted Mr. Conant to spur the police to renewed effort. In addition to this, the Colonel and his lawyer usually spent the best part of each day pursuing investigations on their own account, with the result that Mary Louise was left to mope alone in the hotel rooms. The young girl was fond of Alora and secretly terrified over her mysterious disappearance. She tried to embroider, as she sat alone and waited for something to happen, but her nerveless fingers would not hold the needle. She bought some novels, but could not keep her mind on the stories. Hour by hour she gazed from the window into the crowded street below, searching each form and face for some resemblance to Alora. She had all the newspapers sent to her room, that she might scan the advertisements and personals for a clue, and this led her to following the news of the Great War, in which she found a partial distraction from her worries. And one morning, after her grandfather and the lawyer had left her, she was glancing over the columns of the Tribune, when an item caught her eye that drew from her a cry of astonishment. The item read as follows: "The grand prize at the exhibition of American paintings being held in the Art Institute was yesterday awarded by the jury to the remarkable landscape entitled 'Poppies and Pepper Trees,' by the California artist Jason Jones. The picture has not only won praise from eminent critics, but has delighted the thousands of visitors who have flocked to the exhibition, so the award is a popular one. The associated artists are tendering a banquet tonight to Jason Jones at the Congress Hotel, where he is staying. The future of this clever artist promises well and will be followed with interest by all admirers of his skillful technique and marvelous coloring." Mary Louise read this twice, trying to understand what it meant. Then she read it a third time. "How strangely we have all been deceived in Alora's father," she murmured. "I remember that Grandpa Jim once claimed that any man so eccentric might well possess talent, but even Mr. Jones's own daughter did not believe he was a true artist. And Alora never guessed he was still continuing to paint, alone and in secret, or that he had regained his former powers and was creating a masterpiece. We have all been sadly wrong in our judgment of Jason Jones. Only his dead wife knew he was capable of great things." She dropped the paper, still somewhat bewildered by the remarkable discovery. "And he is here in Chicago, too," she mused, continuing her train of thought. "And we all thought he was stupidly learning to fly in Dorfield. Oh, now I understand why he allowed Alora to go with us. He wanted to exhibit his picture, the picture whose very existence he had so carefully guarded, and knew that with all of us out of the way, afloat upon the Great Lakes, he could come here without our knowledge and enter the picture in the exhibition. It may be he doubted its success, he is diffident in some ways, and thought if it failed none of us at home would be the wiser, but I'm sure that now he has won he will brag and bluster and be very conceited and disagreeable over his triumph. That is the man's nature, to be cowed by failure and bombastic over success. It's singular, come to think it over, how one who has the soul to create a wonderful painting can be so crude and uncultured, so morose and cruel." Suddenly she decided to go and look at the picture. The trip would help to relieve her loneliness, and she was eager to see what Jason Jones had really accomplished. The Institute was not so far from her hotel. She could walk the distance in a few minutes, so she put on her hat and set out for the exhibition. On her way, disbelief assailed her. "I don't see how the man did it," she mentally declared. "I wonder if that item is just a huge joke, because the picture was so bad that the reporter tried to be ironical." But when she entered the exhibition and found a small crowd gathered around one picture, it was still early in the day, she dismissed at once that doubtful supposition. "That is the Jason Jones picture," said an attendant, answering her question and nodding toward the admiring group. "That's the prize winner. Over there." Mary Louise edged her way through the crowd until the great picture was in full view, and then she drew a long breath, awestruck, delighted, filled with a sense of all-pervading wonder. "It's a tremendous thing," whispered a man beside her to his companion. There's nothing in the exhibit to compare with it. And how it breathes the very spirit of California." "California?" thought Mary Louise. Of course, those yellow poppies and lacy pepper trees with their deep red berries were typical of no other place. And the newspaper had called Jason Jones a California artist. When had he been in California, she wondered? Alora had never mentioned visiting the Pacific coast. Yet sometime surely her father must have lived there. Was it while Alora was a small child, and after her mother had cast him off? He could have made sketches then and preserved them for future use. As she stood there marvelling at the superb genius required to produce such a masterpiece of art, a strange notion crept stealthily into her mind. Promptly she drove it out, but it presently returned. It would not be denied. Finally it mastered her. "Anyhow," she reflected, setting her teeth together, "I'll beard the wolf in his den. If my intuition has played me false, at worst the man can only sneer at me, and I've always weathered his scornful moods. But if I am right—" The suggestion was too immense to consider calmly. With quick, nervous steps she hastened to the Congress Hotel and sent up her card to Jason Jones. On it she had written in pencil: "I shall wait for you in the parlor. Please come to me." End of Chapter 24. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 5 of Mary Louise Solves a Mystery by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. An interruption. "Before you sign this promissory note," remarked Janet Orme, as Alora reluctantly seated herself at the table, "you must perform the other part of your agreement, and give me the present address of your father, Jason Jones." "He lives in Dorfield," said Alora. "Write his street number, here on this separate sheet." The girl complied. "Is it a private house, or is it a studio?" "A cottage. Father doesn't paint any more." "That is very sensible of him," declared the nurse. "Yet I wonder how he can resist painting. He has always had a passion for the thing and in the old days was never happy without a brush in his hand. He had an idea he could do something worth while, but that was mere delusion, for he never turned out anything decent, or that would sell in the market. Therefore the money he spent for paints, brushes and canvas, money I worked hard to earn, was absolutely wasted. Does your father keep any servants?" "One maid, an Irish girl born in the town." "Still economical, I see. Well, that's all the information I require. You have given your word of honor not to notify him that I have discovered his whereabouts. Is it not so?" "Yes," said Alora. "Now sign the note." Alora, pen in hand, hesitated while she slowly read the paper again. She hated to give $50,000 to this scheming woman, even though the loss of such a sum would not seriously impair her fortune. But what could she do? "Sign it, girl!" exclaimed Janet impatiently. Alora searched the note for a loophole that would enable her afterward to repudiate it. She knew nothing of legal phrases, yet the wording seemed cleverly constructed to defeat any attempt to resist payment. "Sign!" cried the woman. With a pen hovering over the place where she had been told to write her name, Alora still hesitated, and seeing this nurse's face grow dark with anger. A sudden click sounded from the hall door, but neither heard it. "Sign!" she repeated, half rising with a threatening gesture. "No, don't sign, please," said a clear voice, and a short, stumpy girl with red hair and a freckled face calmly entered the room and stood smilingly before them. Janet uttered an exclamation of surprise and annoyance, and sank back in her chair, glaring at the intruder. Alora stared in speechless amazement at the smiling girl, whom she had never seen before. "How did you get in here?" demanded Janet angrily. "Why, I just unlocked the door and walked in," was the reply, delivered in a cheery and somewhat triumphant voice. "This is a private apartment." "Indeed! I thought it was a prison," said the girl. "I imagined you, Mrs. Orme, to be a jailer, and this young person, who is Miss Alora Jones, I believe, I supposed to be your prisoner. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I guess I'm right." The nurse paled. The look she flashed from her half-veiled eyes was a dangerous look. She knew in the instant that the stranger had come to liberate Alora, but the next instant she reflected that not all was lost, for she had already decided to release her prisoner without compulsion. It was important to her plans, however, that she obtain the promissory note, so instantly controlling herself, she lightly touched Alora's arm and said in her usual soft voice, "Sign your name, my dear, then we will talk with this person." Alora did not move to obey, for she had caught a signal from the red-headed girl. "I object to your signing that paper," protested the stranger, seating herself in a vacant chair. "I haven't the faintest idea what it is you're about to sign, But if I were you, I wouldn't do it." "It is the price of my liberty," explained Alora. "Well, this is a free country and liberty doesn't cost anything. I've a carriage waiting outside, and I will drive you back to the Colonel and Mary Louise free of charge. You won't even have to whack up on the cab hire." The nurse slowly rose and faced the girl. "Who are you?" she demanded. "No one of importance," was the answer. "I'm just Josie O'Gorman, the daughter of John O'Gorman of Washington, who is a lieutenant in the government's secret service." "Then you're a detective." "The aforesaid John O'Gorman declares I'm not. He says I must learn a lot before I become a real detective, so at present I'm just practicing. Mary Louise is my friend, you know," she continued, now addressing Alora, "and you're a friend of Mary Louise, so when you mysteriously disappeared she telegraphed me, and I came on to hunt you up. That wasn't an easy job for an amateur detective, I assure you, and it cost me a lot of time and some worry, but glory be, I've now got you located and Mrs. Orme's jig is up." The nurse moved softly to the door that led into the passage and locked it, putting the key into her pocket. "Now," she said with another flash of those curious eyes, "I have 2 prisoners." Josie laughed. "I could almost have sworn you'd try that trick," she remarked. "It was on the cards and you couldn't resist it. Permit me to say, Mrs. Orme, that you're a rather clever woman, and I admire cleverness even when it's misdirected. But my daddy has taught me, in his painstaking way, not to be caught napping. A good soldier provides for a retreat as well as an advance. I've been on your trail for a long time, and only this morning succeeded in winning the confidence of the cabman who drove you here. Wasn't sure, of course, that you were still here, until I saw Alora's face at the window a while ago. Then I knew I'd caught you. The cab is a closed one and holds 4 inside, so I invited 3 policemen to accompany me. One is at the back of this house, one at the front door, and the third is just outside here on the landing. Probably he can hear us talking. He's a big man, that third policeman, and if I raise my voice to cry out he could easily batter down the door you have locked and come to my rescue. Now, will you be good, Mrs. Orme?" The nurse realized her defeat. She deliberately took the note from the table and tore it up. "You have really foiled me, my girl," she said philosophically, "although if you knew all you would not blame me for what I have done. You've decided not to dig any money out of Alora, then? It wouldn't matter to her, but I've abandoned the idea. However, I shall insist on making Jones pay me liberally for my disappointment. Now, take the girl and go on. Get your things, Alora." Josie regarded her thoughtfully. "I had intended to arrest you, Mrs. Orme," she remarked, "but honestly, I can't see what good it would do, while it would cause Mary Louise and the dear Colonel a heap of trouble in prosecuting you. So, unless Miss Jones objects—" "All I want is to get away from here, to be out of her clutches," asserted Alora. "Then let us go. The woman deserves punishment, but doubtless she'll get her just deserts in other ways. Get your things on, my dear. The cab and the policeman are waiting." Janet Orme unlocked the door to the passage. Then she stood motionless, with drooping eyelids, while the 2 girls passed out. Alora, greatly unnerved and still fearful, clung to the arm of her rescuer. When they had gained the street and were about to enter the closed automobile, she asked: "Where are the 3 policemen?" "Invisible," returned Josie very cheerfully. "I had to invent that story, my dear, and the recording angel is said to forgive detectives for lying." She followed Alora into the car and closed the door. "Drive to the Blackington, please," she called to the driver. And, as they whirled away, she leaned from the window and waved a parting signal to Mrs. Orme, who stood in the upper window, her face contorted and scowling with chagrin at the discovery that she had been outwitted by a mere girl. End of Chapter 25. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Mary Louise Solves a Mystery by L. Frank Baum. Read for LibriVox.org into the public domain. Jason Jones. The Colonel and Peter Conant had just entered the drawing-room of the suite at the hotel and found Mary Louise absent. This was unusual and unaccountable, and they were wondering what could have become of the girl, when the door suddenly burst open and Josie's clear voice cried triumphantly: "I've got her! I've captured the missing heiress at last!" Both men, astonished, rose to their feet as Alora entered and with a burst of tears threw her arms around the old Colonel's neck. For a few moments the tableau was dramatic, all being speechless with joy at the reunion. Colonel Hathaway patted Alora's head and comforted the sobbing girl as tenderly as if she had been his own grandchild, or Mary Louise. Josie perched herself lightly on the center table and, swinging her legs complacently back and forth, explained her discovery in a stream of chatter, for she was justly elated by her success. "And to think," she concluded, "that I never missed a clue! that it was really the nurse, Mrs. Orme, Mrs. Jones's old nurse, who stole Alora, according to our suspicions, and that her object was just what I thought, to get money from that miser, Jason Jones. Daddy will be pleased with this triumph. I'm pleased. Mary Louise will be pleased. And, by the way, where is Mary Louise?" "I don't know," confessed the Colonel, who had just placed Alora, now more self-possessed, in a chair. "I was beginning to worry about her when you came in. She seldom leaves these rooms, except for a few moments, and even then she tells me, or leaves word, where she is going. I spoke to the clerk, when I returned, and he said she had left the hotel early this morning, and it's now 4 o'clock." Josie's smile faded and her face became grave. "Now who," she said, "could have an object in stealing Mary Louise? Complications threaten us in this manner, and the first thing we must do is—" "Oh, Alora!" exclaimed Mary Louise, who had softly opened the door and caught sight of her friend. Next moment the two girls were locked in an embrace, and Josie, a shade of disappointment struggling with her sunny smile, remarked coolly: "Very well. That beats the champion female detective out of another job. But I might have known Mary Louise wouldn't get herself stolen. No such adventure ever happens to her." Mary Louise turned to the speaker with an earnest look on her sweet face. "An adventure has happened to me, Josie, and I hardly know how to break the news." She held Alora at arm's length and looked gravely into her friend's face. Alora noted the serious expression and said quickly: "What is it? Bad news for me?" I think not," replied Mary Louise hesitatingly. "But it's wonderful news, and I hardly know how to break it to you." "The best way," remarked Josie, much interested, "is to let it all out in a gush. Wonderful stuff never causes anyone to faint." "Alora," said Mary Louise solemnly, "your father is here." "Where?" "He is just outside, in the corridor." "Why doesn't he come in?" asked the Colonel. "He needn't have worried about me," said Alora in a sullen tone, "but I suppose it was the danger of losing his money that—" "No," interrupted Mary Louise, "you mistake me. Jason Jones, the great artist, a splendid, cultured man, and—" A sharp rap at the door made her pause. Answering the Colonel's summons a bellboy entered. "For Mr. Conant, sir," he said, offering a telegram. The lawyer tore open the envelope as the boy went out, and after a glance at it, exclaimed in shocked surprise: "Great heavens!" Then he passed the message to Colonel Hathaway, who in turn read it and passed it to Josie O'Gorman. Blank silence followed, while Mary Louise and Alora eyed the others expectantly. "Who did you say is outside in the corridor?" demanded Josie in a puzzled tone. "Alora's father," replied Mary Louise. "Jason Jones?" "Jason Jones," repeated Mary Louise gravely. "Well, then, listen to this telegram. It was sent to Mr. Peter Conant from Dorfield and says: 'Jason Jones killed by falling from an airplane at 10 o'clock this morning. Notify his daughter.'" Alora drew a quick breath and clasped her hands over her heart. Uncongenial as the two had been, Jason Jones was her father, her only remaining parent, and the suddenness of his death shocked and horrified the girl. Indeed, all present were horrified, yet Mary Louise seemed to bear the news more composedly than the others, as if it were a minor incident in a great drama. She slipped an arm around her girl friend's waist and said soothingly: "Never mind, dear. It is dreadful, I know. What an awful way to die! And yet, Alora, it may all be for the best." Josie slid down from the table. Her active brain was the first to catch a glimmering of what Mary Louise meant. "Shall I call the man in?" she asked excitedly. "The man whom you say is Alora's father?" "No," answered Mary Louise. "Let me go for him, please. I must tell him this strange news myself. Try to quiet yourself, Alora, and be prepared. I'm going to introduce you to Jason Jones." She uttered the last sentence slowly and with an earnestness that bewildered all her hearers, except perhaps Josie O'Gorman, and then she left the room. The little group scarcely moved or spoke. It seemed an age to them, yet it was only a few moments, when Mary Louise came back, leading by the hand a tall, handsome gentleman who bore in every feature, in every movement, the mark of good birth, culture and refinement, and in a voice that trembled with nervous excitement the girl announced: "This is Jason Jones, a California artist, the man who married Antoinette Seaver. He is Alora's father, and the other why, the other was a fraud, of course!" exclaimed Josie. End of Chapter 26. Read by Sabella Denton. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Louise Solves a Mystery by L. Frank Baum. What Mary Louise accomplished. I am quite sure it is unnecessary to relate in detail the scene that followed Mary Louise's introduction, or the excited inquiries and explanations which naturally ensued. To those present the scene was intensely dramatic and never to be forgotten, but such a meeting between father and daughter is considered too sacred to be described here. Mary Louise's intuition had not played her false. She had found at the Congress Hotel another Jason Jones, far different from the one she had known, and a few questions elicited the fact that he was indeed the father of Alora. So, as briefly as she could, she told him how another man had usurped his place, and seized all of Alora's income, at the same time willfully depriving the girl of such comforts and accomplishments as one in her position should enjoy. "And to think," she added indignantly, "that he is not Jason Jones at all!" "I believe you are mistaken there," replied the artist thoughtfully. "Jason is a family name, derived from one of our most eminent ancestors, and in my generation it is also borne, I have learned, by one of my second cousins, a Jason Jones who is also a painter and aspires to fame as an artist. I have never met the man, but his indifferently executed canvases, offered for sale under our common name, formerly caused me considerable annoyance, and perhaps interfered with my career. But of late I have not heard of this Jason Jones, for soon after my separation from my wife I went to Southern California, and located in a little bungalow hidden in a wild canyon of the Santa Monica Mountains. There I have secluded myself for years, determined to do some really good work before I returned east to prove my ability. Some time after Antoinette died I saw a notice to that effect in a newspaper, but there were no comments and I did not know that she had made me guardian of our child. That was like Antoinette," he continued in gentler tones. "She was invariably generous and considerate of my shortcomings, even after we realized we were not fitted to live together. Her renunciation of me seemed harsh at first, for I could not understand her ambitions, but in fact she drove me to success. I have won the grand prize, after all these years of patient labor, and from now on my future is assured." "Have you never longed for your child?" asked Mary Louise reproachfully. "I have indeed. In imagination I have followed Alora's growth and development year by year, and one of my most cherished anticipations, when coming here, was to seek out my daughter and make myself known to her. I knew she had been well provided for in worldly goods, and I hoped to find her happy and content. If my picture received favorable comment at the exhibition, I intended to seek Alora. I did not expect to win the grand prize." It was this newly discovered Jason Jones and his daughter, who already loved him and shyly clung to this responsive and congenial parent, who went to Dorfield with the Colonel and Mary Louise and Peter Conant and Josie O'Gorman to attend the obsequies of the other less fortunate Jason Jones. Mrs. Orme was there, too, Mrs. Janet Orme Jones, for she admitted she was the dead man's wife, and told them, in a chastened but still defiant mood, how the substitution of her husband for the other artist had come about. "Many years ago, when I was nursing in a New York hospital," she said, "a man was brought in with both arms broken, having been accidentally knocked down by a streetcar. I was appointed to nurse him and learned from him that he was Jason Jones, a poor artist who was, however, just about to win recognition. He showed me a newspaper clipping that highly praised a painting then being exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was signed Jason Jones. I know now that it wasn't his picture at all, but the work of his cousin, but at the time the clipping deceived me. I was ambitious to become something more than a nurse. I thought that to be the wife of a famous artist would bring me wealth and a position in society, so I married Jason Jones, without love, and he married me, also without love, in order to get my wages. He won where I lost, for during several years I foolishly supported him with my savings, always expecting him to become famous. At first he attributed his failures to his broken arms, although they had healed perfectly, and I ignorantly accepted the excuse. It was only after years of waiting for the man to prove his ability that I finally woke to the truth, that he had no talent, and then I left him to his own devices. In Chicago I sought to forget my unfortunate past and found regular employment there in my profession. It was while nursing Mrs. Jones that I overheard her give to Dr. Anstruther the supposed address of her husband, which had been furnished her by a casual acquaintance, and tell him to wire Jason Jones to come to her at once. I well knew a mistake had been made and that she had given the doctor my own husband's address, the address of an entirely different Jason Jones. My first impulse was to undeceive her, but that would involve humiliating explanations, so I hesitated and finally decided to remain silent. When the doctor had gone to telegraph and the die was cast, I reflected that my husband, whom I knew to be sunk in poverty, would ignore the request to come to Chicago to be reconciled to his dying wife. My Jason wouldn't care whether I lived or died, and wouldn't have spent a cent to be reconciled with me. For of course he would think it was I who asked for him, since he would know nothing of Antoinette Seaver Jones, or that she was the wife of his distant relative, the other Jason Jones. He did, indeed, answer Dr. Anstruther by saying he would not come unless his expenses were advanced, so the good doctor launched the future deception by sending him ample funds. I knew of this action, and wondered what I ought to do. There would be a terrible mix-up when my husband appeared, and I realized how disappointed the sick woman would be. Knowing her condition to be dangerous, I feared the shock would kill her, which it really did, for still I kept silent. I told myself that I had not aided in the deception in any way, that it was a trick of fate, and I could not be blamed. I thought that when Dr. Anstruther met my husband there would be explanations and the truth would come out, but somehow that did not happen. Jason Jones walked into Antoinette Seaver Jones's room expecting to find me dying, and saw a strange woman in the bed and his wife, in good health, standing before him. He let out an oath in his surprise, and my patient, who had raised up in bed to stare at him, uttered a low moan and fell back on her pillow, dead. I saw the tragedy and involuntarily screamed, and Jason Jones saw she was dead and cried out in fear. I had just time to recover my wits and whisper to him to keep his mouth shut and I would make him rich, when Dr. Anstruther hurried into the room. The whole thing was unpremeditated up to that time, but now I assisted fate, for I had witnessed Mrs. Jones's will and knew well its contents. No one seemed to know there were two artists named Jason Jones, and everyone accepted my husband as Alora's father and the one entitled to her guardianship, and to profit by the terms of the will. An hour after Mrs. Jones died I secured a secret interview with my husband, who until then had been thoroughly bewildered, and explained to him that the mistaken identity would, if he took prompt advantage of it, give him the control of an enormous income for 7 years, until the child reached the age of 18. He was fearful, at first, that the other Jason Jones would appear and prosecute him for swindling, but as the husband of Antoinette Seaver had not been heard from in years, even by his own wife, I induced him to accept the risk. It was I who virtually put that income into my husband's hands, and in return he agreed to supply me with whatever money I demanded, up to half of his receipts. But he proved that there is not always honor among thieves, for after he had been made legal executor of the estate, and his fears had somewhat subsided, he endeavored to keep all the money for himself, and begrudged me the 1 or 2 installments I forced him to give me. Strangely enough, this formerly poverty-stricken artist now developed a love of accumulation, a miserly love for the money itself, and hated to spend any of it, even on himself or on the girl to whom he owed his good fortune. The coward actually ran away and hid himself in Europe, and I, having spent all the money he had given me, with the idea I had an inexhaustible fund to draw upon, was forced to turn nurse again. After 3 years I had saved enough to follow him to Europe, where I located him at a lonely villa in Italy. Its very loneliness was my undoing, for he made a husky servant lock me up in an outhouse, and there I was held prisoner until Jason had again escaped to America. He thought he could hide better in the United States, and that I wouldn't have the money to follow him there, but I had fortunately saved enough for my return passage. By the time I got home, however, he had completely disappeared, and all my efforts failed to locate him. So I returned to Chicago, and again resumed my profession. You will say I might have denounced him as an impostor, and made the police hunt him up, but that would have ruined my chances of ever getting another penny of the money, and might have involved me personally. Jason knew that, and it made him bold to defy me. I silently bided my time, believing that fate would one day put the man in my power. You know how I happened to find Alora in Chicago, and how I lured her to my home and kept her there a prisoner. It was found that the dead man had made large investments in his own name, and as he had left no will, Janet declared that this property now belonged to her, as his widow. Lawyer Conant, however, assured her that as the money had never legally been her husband's, but was secured by him under false pretenses, all the investments and securities purchased with it must be transferred to the real Jason Jones, to whom they now belonged. The court would attend to that matter. "And it serves you right, madam," added Peter Conant, "for concocting the plot to swindle Alora's father out of the money his dead wife intended him to have. You are not properly punished, for you should be sent to jail, but your disappointment will prove a slight punishment at least." "As far as I knew," answered Janet, defending her crime, "Alora's father was either dead or hidden in some corner of the world where he could never be found. To my knowledge there was no such person extant, so the substitution of my husband for him did no injury and merely kept the income out of the clutches of paid executors. Had the right man appeared, at any time during these 4 years, to claim his child and the money, he might easily have secured them by proving his identity, so the fault was as much his as mine." Jason Jones had personally listened to the woman's confession, which filled him with wonder. While severely condemning her unscrupulous methods he refused to prosecute her, although Mr. Conant urged him to do so, and even carried his generosity to the extent of presenting her with one of her dead husband's small investments, obtaining from her in return the promise to lead an honest and respectable life. It had been the artist's intention to return to his California bungalow, but after the probate court had acknowledged him and had transferred to him the guardianship of his daughter, he decided to devote the coming years to Alora and endeavor to recompense her with fatherly devotion for the privations and unhappiness she had formerly endured. Alora did not wish to be separated from Mary Louise, so her father purchased the handsome residence of Senator Huling, which was situated directly opposite to that of Colonel Hathaway in Dorfield, and succeeded in making it a real home for his daughter. Josie O'Gorman went back to Washington well pleased with her success, although she said, with a little grimace of feigned regret, "I did pretty well, for an amateur, for I tackled a tough case and won out. But after all, it was Mary Louise who solved the mystery, and restored Alora to her honest and true father." End of Chapter 27. End of Mary Louise Solves a Mystery by L. Frank Baum. Read by Sabella Denton, in Carrollton, Georgia. In March, 2009.